Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is World Watchers. It is program number 787. It is January the 5th, 1987. And I have a good story for you to start the new year with. For old-time listeners to World Watchers, you'll especially appreciate this evening's broadcast. And for the new listeners, there is a lot to inform you about that explains why I've been working so hard along particular lines, and I think you'll get a better vision of those matters by listening to some of the material I'm going to share this evening. People are looking for similarities between Watergate and Reagangate. It's hard to find them if you don't even know what Watergate is. Watergate has a definition that means different things to different people, but for me, Watergate was a palace coup. It was a way to move out Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew. It is an original idea of mine. Louis Tackwood of the Los Angeles Police Department, who was part of Squad 19 and quit them because of the reasons they were planning. They were planning to kill Richard Nixon to make Spiro Agnew president, with international connections to the Greek military junta and fascism abroad as well as in the United States. The Select Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Watergate, Representative Pike's Committee in the House of Representatives, and Senator Frank Church's investigations into some of the dirty dealings and manipulations of our hidden government were able to expose a little bit of the power structure that was misbehaving, but they weren't removed from office for the crimes that they did. They were removed for perjury for not telling the truth about the crimes, and then the lid was quickly closed. Reagangate is the continuation of the process. The same people that moved out Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew can get rid of Ronald Reagan or George Bush, whoever they want. And now the power struggle is getting more open, tighter, meaner, and in control. We observe the process and sit around and root for those slimy bastards that have done wrong so many times, such as Ronald Reagan and Oliver North or George Bush or Admiral Poindexter or George Shultz, and we watch how they get fingered for various things that they did that they got caught at. They don't consider them crimes, but when they're exposed, then they're removed. But the important thing is to keep your eyes on the manipulators, not the victims of the scandal, and I've been giving evidence of this for the past weeks since November, and I'll review my opinion on those manipulators for you in a moment. Now, at the time of the scandal of Banco Ambrosiano and the P2 and the secret government that wanted a Nazi Mussolini-type government in Italy and throughout the world, when that exposure was opened up in 1981 and the names of the operatives, over 700 of them in Italy alone, were exposed, people like Roberto Calvi, the president of Banco Ambrosiano, could be killed. He was hung off a bridge in London. Michele Sindona can be given cyanide in a jail in Italy, but then a very high team member, one of two top members of the world team, one is Francesco Pazienza and the other is Licio Gelli, they're still walking around the streets. There's an article this past week, or not past week, 2 weeks ago, in the Wall Street Journal, just a small item. Prison officials in Italy said former Secret Service agent Francesco Pazienza, who had been tied to a series of major crimes and Italian political plots, was released from prison in turn on provisional liberty. He was extradited from the United States in June of 1986 and was questioned about the 1982 collapse of Banco Ambrosiano. Now, he also was named as a co-conspirator in the plans to blow up the Bologna bombing, where 81 people were killed and others were injured. He was part of the Aldo Moro murder and setting up the Red Brigades, and a lot of what appeared as leftist organizations being violent were set up by Francesco Pazienza. He's a close associate of Alexander Haig. I've cited some of their meetings together, of Michael Ledeen, who's involved in the CONTRA-GATE, who set up the original meetings between the Israeli agents, or allegedly he did, he's the front man, and between the Iranian officials along with Saudi Arabian representatives, Michael Ledeen from the National Security Council. But Licio Gelli after attending Ronald Reagan's inauguration. That was in January 81. He was mentioned as the head of the P2. He was in Hitler's Gestapo. He fled then down to South America, where he was after the war. Because of his work with Mussolini, he fled to Argentina and then came back to Italy to set up this fascist government again for World War III. And now he's living in South America. So Pazienza and Gelli are free. Calvi and Sindona are dead. But the manipulators seem to stay in control and stay away from the heat of the exposures. And if they want to think of a lesser crime for Pazienza, they refer to the 1962 collapse of the bank and not all the series of murders that he was a part of. Now, so last week on World Watchers, I cited an article in the Washington Post, December 1986, an Evans and Novak column. That's Rowland Evans and Robert Novak. I'm sure you see Novak on Crossfire frequently. I watch it almost every day. And the information for the material I gave you on the air, that Frank Carlucci, the new National Security Advisor, was working with Sven Kraemer, the son of Fritz Kraemer, came from Fletcher Prouty in Washington, D.C. I was talking to him on the telephone that morning. I usually never put anything on World Watchers that I don't see and have in my hands myself, but I felt I could trust L. Fletcher Prouty. He wrote the book The Secret Team, the CIA and its allies in control of the world. The paperback was published by Ballantine in 1970, and it's a good book. Prouty was a pilot who, I believe, flew President Roosevelt to Tehran conferences. He was very high up in the Air Force. In terms, he retired as a colonel, U.S. Air Force, but he was very high up in attending these conferences, going to 60 countries, and he was the liaison between the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Department for quite a few years, from 1955, when the Cold War had escalated quite considerably, to December 31st, 1963, 9 days after Kennedy was murdered. He attended briefing conferences with Henry Kissinger, and he was very important as the middleman. These kinds of persons with a lot of skills are used as couriers or messengers between two agencies, and at the time they're working, they're not identified. And it was his information last week that I shared with you about Sven Kraemer. But within a few days of that program last Monday, a listener to World Watchers in Houston, Texas, sent me the article that was the one that Prouty was telling me about, and it wasn't Sven Kraemer at all that these men were writing about. It was something much worse, and Fletcher should have known it. It was about Fritz Kraemer himself, the father of Sven, the man that I've been searching for 3 or 4 years. I've lost track now on how long I've been looking for Fritz Kraemer. I had the General Accounting Office messenger sent it to my house, and I'll read you the correspondence we had after they left here. They were here for about 6 hours talking to me about Fritz Kraemer, and wouldn't confirm or deny much except to write him off as non-existent or the German Kraemer dead, and they passed the buck. I'm going to read to you the entire article from the Houston Post. It's a syndicated column that was in other papers, and I'm going to read it to you because sometimes I extract and outline, but I think when you hear this story, and it takes one to know one, so Robert Novak knows one, and so does Rowland Evans, you will get a picture of the White House that I've been trying to describe on the air for 16 years. This is the article from the Houston Post. It's dated there December the 24th. New staff selections on the White House, that's the title, could bring up, elevate Reagan's happiness. I cut off the last word, or the adjective they used on the new staff selections. Washington. The glimmer of the first silver lining in the cloud darkening President Reagan's presidency is discernible in the new staff at the National Security Council. The glimmer of the first silver lining. It says the National Security Council was the original source of Reagan's troubles, where an unexpectedly rich transfusion of blood now is raising the hopes for preserving Reaganite national security policies. The new staff selections by incoming National Security Advisor Frank Carlucci have stunned the bureaucracy. Nobody expected him to hire Jose S. Sorzano, a Gene Kirkpatrick protege, and the CIA's Fritz W. Ermarth, privately described by William Casey as the strongest Soviet specialist in town. On top of that hardline arms control specialist, Fritz Kraemer unexpectedly is being retained, which means that Fritz Kraemer has been there all along running the National Security Council under Ronald Reagan, who has been giving out this evil empire business from the day that he became president. The article continues. That foretells career civil servant Carlucci's intention to halt policy power filtering from the Reagan White House to the State Department, as Secretary of State George Shultz had planned since the Iran's arms scandal began early in November. It guarantees tough, down-the-line competition with Shultz, not obeisance from a disgraced NSC staff as feared by the conservatives. Let me just explain that again. By having Fritz Kraemer at the top of matters in the National Security Council, that does away with any intention to filter down from the White House to the State Department any plans that George Shultz thought he had, that it guarantees that the NSC will be tough and there will be no competition, literally, with George Shultz, and no disgraced National Security Council will have to cow down to our State Department. It goes on, the top of the line for salvaging the president's national security policies is called the Reagan Doctrine. It was left bleeding and half dead when arms deals engineered by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North were discovered. The word is discovered. Congressional Democrats, never happy with the Reagan Doctrine's aspirations of forcing back communism at the fringes, are using the scandal to undermine the doctrine, as well as in Angola, as well as in Nicaragua. Let's translate that again. The Congressional Democrats, who don't like Reagan's aspirations of forcing back communism at the fringes, and one of the conditions of the terrorism policy of the NSC, not one of the conditions, but one of the things they wrote in was attack a country before it gets dangerous. Don't wait to see what it does. And they attacked and tested the waters with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya just to bomb his place to get their own kicks, to show him who's the strongest and most powerful. This column continues. This environment was shaken by Carlucci's decision to go for and get Sorzano, who fled Fidel Castro's Cuba after serving Kirkpatrick's UN deputy. He became president of the Cuban-American Foundation. It is no mere atmospheric change. Now, when Jean Kirkpatrick was our UN ambassador, she gave a momentous speech at the time the Korean airline went down, synchronizing it with lies and untruths, the same distortions the NSC feels that they are legally obligated to use if they're fighting Russia. And she has Mr. Sorzano as her protege there. And at the same time, Alexander Haig and Kraemer and Kissinger have the desire to invade Cuba. Alexander Haig, as Secretary of State, wanted to invade Cuba in 1981, and they will certainly take over Nicaragua with this staff going. To continue, in shifts, the National Security Council's Latin American policy chief, from a highly regarded foreign service dependent on long-term relations with the State Department, will move to a tough intellectual with impeccable Reaganite credentials who is accountable to no one in the bureaucracy. And the NSC is accountable to nobody, and this man is accountable to no one in the bureaucracy, sitting there with Fritz Kraemer, and Kraemer having the absolute top word, being the top dog, and there is no one in our government that can speak up to him. He accounts to nobody. He isn't appointed by the Congress. He isn't approved by the Congress. He is handpicked by Jean Kirkpatrick, who comes out of that Center for Strategic and International Studies, Mr. Abshire, who is brought in by the president to oversee what he should know and what he shouldn't know, is part of that Center for Strategic International Studies. He set it up with Richard Allen. The money came from Germany originally to set it up, and now they're saying in this particular column they are accountable to no one in the bureaucracy, and Evans and Novak like that a lot. It continues the column. Frank Carlucci, for the best, strongest people he can find with a pro-Reagan orientation, Kirkpatrick told us. He found one in Sorzeno. A similar orientation pervades Ermarth. He replaces Jack Matlock, a senior State Department specialist in U.S.-Soviet relations, suspected by the right of Dantontism. The right suspects that wanting to get along with the Soviet Union is a crime, and there's been a big shift in the White House, in the NSC, and State Department, in the CIA, and I'm keeping track of the job changes. He was suspected by the right of Dantonism. God help us, you know. Then it goes on, Ermarth's work in the U.S.-Soviet strategic evaluation during Zbigniew Brzezinski's tenure as Jimmy Carter's national security advisor impressed Casey. Now, it was that time period when the Polish Pope from Auschwitz was selected, thanks to Zbigniew Brzezinski. It was also the time of the heating up of the Cold War, where they were to use Michael Ledeen, Paul Hentze, and Claire Sterling from the Center of Strategic International Studies to try to blame that disinformation on a Bulgarian Soviet Union plot. The column goes on, Casey brought Mr. Ermarth back to the CIA in 1984 as his top intelligence advisor on Soviet affairs, and Brzezinski is one of those people directly under Fritz Kraemer, the master puppet, holding Kissinger in one hand, Brzezinski in the other, so that if a Democrat gets in, Brzezinski runs the NSC, and if Kissinger's in, the Republicans. The column goes on, with futures wholly independent of the State Department, Sorzeno and Ermarth will be tougher players in the defense of the president's policies. They are less susceptible to bureaucratic pressures from Schultz. In other words, they say they are accountable to nobody. They can be tougher in these matters. They can carry the president's policies. And, of course, they write the president's policies. That's the main point of this. They don't carry them. They write them. And they are not susceptible to any bureaucratic pressures, whether it's George Shultz or any Secretary of State. And as I said before, they're accountable to nobody in the bureaucracy. In dealing with the new, far more anti-Reagan Congress, such independence suggests more boldness and imagination in selling the president's foreign policy. They go to Congress and tell them what we need, and they can sell it. They don't need these advertising agencies or the new right to tell them, because they have the outright fascists with the ear of the president, and they can go as the experts from NSC to Congress and say, we are going to tell you this. The Russians are ahead in Star Wars. The Russians are taking over the Pacific Ocean. The Russians are taking over India. And they can get the arms and money and whip up this hysteria about the Soviet Union. Sorzeno, one White House insider, said privately, can and will go toe-to-toe with George Shultz. Reshaping the entire national security staff in the middle of an administration has never been tried before, particularly one that is now on its record fifth national security advisor. Carlucci's original plan was to fire all the staffers with at least 4 years in the Reagan White House. He quickly gave that up because it would have sacrificed some high talent, including strategic arms specialist Fritz Kraemer. He can't get rid of them all, and Sven Kraemer, I said for years, is the liaison of NSC to the president, and I assumed that Fritz took the messages home to Daddy, who then gave the walking orders, where he is with Daniel Graham of SDI, and Fred Ikle, the man who worked with Colonel North and made these independent organizations that appeared humanitarian, to have the military assist in overthrowing Nicaragua, and then later, I'm sure, to invade Cuba, and they were all a part of the invasion of Grenada. Now the column continues. This shakeup was preordained when Attorney General Edwin Meese quietly put his hand on Admiral John Poindexter's shoulder after discovering the Iran-Contra link. The president will never ask you to resign, but John, you ought to. Meese demanded that Poindexter's successor abolish the office out of which North ran his super-secret operations in the basement of the White House. That's being abolished, but he feared that no Poindexter successor, Carlucci or anyone else, would be able to build a new NSC staff capable of performing the coordinating function needed to put the policy back. On the contrary, Carlucci is proving to be adept and calculating housekeeper. Now, the important thing about taking that office out of the basement of the White House, that little super-sees-me, that secret pocket, is to put it right in the White House with the room next to the president. No more secrets, no more tough guys who are hidden with these faceless colonels. We're getting people up in the front office. And remember that when Kraemer, well, I'll remind you of his military record in a minute, when he left the United States Army, he was a lieutenant. So it's pretty good that when they want to get rid of everybody, there still remains the strategic arms specialist, the hardline arms control specialist, unexpectedly retained, which means he was there, and he cannot be moved aside like the others because he is part and parcel of the fixture of the National Security Council decision-making process. Just to conclude this article by Evans and Novak, I said Carlucci is proving adept, you bet he is, and a calculating housekeeper, you bet he is, just what the president needs. He is not content with hiring a new staff capable of coordinating the president's national security policies. He is picking aides who would not sign on without a strong policy-making role. In other words, there's no difference of opinion to argue here, where one wants one thing and one wants the other. He's not going to coordinate the two different voices, or maybe three or four. He's going to have one voice, and they can't get on that ship if they don't think of it as one voice, and they made that clear at the time that the Reagan-Gate started coming apart. Instead of just abolishing North's operation, Carlucci abolished its parent, the political military office headed by Howard Teicher. He fired Teicher. The signal is clear. The first of Reagan's 5 national security advisors with a clear track to the Oval Office, not through Donald J. Reagan or any of the other chief of staff. He's going to cut a swathe of his own to heighten the president's control of his presidency. What he's heightening is a control of their 1,000-year Reich, not of his presidency. His presidency can come and go like McKinley, Sindone, or Spiro, Agnew, or Nixon, or any of the others. His presidency means he is our front man, but they will have control. And they concluded by saying it is a sign of hope, the first in weeks, to have Fritz Kraemer named twice in this one article as being the kind of person that will have direct access to the White House, no more basement, no more kowtowing to Congress, and no more having to deal with the State Department. It's quite clear what they want. Now, who is this Fritz Kraemer? Why do I keep talking about Fritz Kraemer? I'm going to run through a few questions and points about Fritz Kraemer that some of you remember and have, but I owe it to the new listeners to understand about Fritz Kraemer. In all of the biographies and autobiographies of Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, they refer to one man, Mr. Fritz Kraemer, as the man responsible for their career. I mean, they give him credit. And in our army, he left as a lieutenant, and he made this general and this powerful Henry Kissinger. Now, in all the policies where Henry Kissinger has moved, as Secretary of State, in National Security, in the State Department, or with Nelson Rockefeller in the Council of Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission, there has been blood, chaos, wherever he has his influence. And I typed up a sheet of this and sent it with other information at the time the president went to Bitburg. This is taken from that same sheet, so some of you have it. Incidentally, next week, my copying machine is broken today. I will send you the article of Evans and Novak, and on the back I'll put this information that you can send on to members of the committees in Congress or news people with more information on Fritz Kraemer. Now, wherever the countries were overthrown, the narcotics followed. When it was in Southeast Asia, in Laos, the opium started coming in. The people involved with CONTRA-GATE, defendants in the Christic Institute, General Secor, General SINGLAUB, Thomas Kleins, and Theodore Shackley from the CIA were all involved with opium traffic in Southeast Asia, in Laos, in the Nugan Bank, and bringing opium and narcotics into the United States. Kissinger made policies of narcotics in Asia in this way. In Iran, where he helped Nelson Rockefeller and the CIA with the first coup, overthrowing Mossadegh and putting in the Shah of Iran. The Shah was a great drug trafficker via Marseille and the French connections. In Pakistan, when Bhutto was killed and Zia took care of the drug traffic, they've become one of the largest drug dealers in the world. Henry Kissinger changed that government. He worked closely with the escape of Klaus Barbie and was with him in the war, after the war in Germany, and was instrumental in contacts and politics in Bolivia when Barbie began to instigate his ascendancy in the cocaine traffic after Richard Nixon came to power out of Bolivia. South Korea and Japan have used Ryosha Sasakawa, the old Kuomintang gang, the China lobby, to get power through narcotics and so forth. Wherever Kissinger has had policies in Southeast Asia, Iran, Pakistan, Bolivia, Brazil, South America, Central America, Middle East, it had to do with the escalation into our banks of about $80 billion of narcotics and drug money coming in thanks to these policies. Henry Kissinger had a long association with Hitler's top generals, even though he was young after World War II. He was in the U.S. Army, CIC, the Intelligence Corps, the 970th Division, in charge of Klaus Barbie in 1945. John J. McCloy, who we know from, or you should know, was on the Warren Commission and concealed the Nazi roles in the murder of John Kennedy, released the top Nazi criminals that were arrested, and he's the gentleman who put Henry Kissinger into Harvard, and along with Peter Drucker and Mr. Fritz Kraemer, they handled Kissinger's career from Harvard to the Council of Foreign Relations into the State Department. Klaus Barbie became a cocaine king, along with the government officials in Bolivia. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon were close to those men in power. He was assigned to be in charge of top Nazis after the war when he was just very, very young, and then after that went to Harvard and was stationed in Germany at Oberammergau, Germany, which is one of the most anti-Semitic cities in Germany. Henry Kissinger's mentor was described in a Washington Post article, March the 2nd, 1975, by a gentleman who he's not around anymore. He passed away, the author of this particular document, but it's the first article. Nick Thimish is his name. It's the first article, and probably the only one, about Fritz Kraemer in the United States that has been available up to this time. He referred to him as a plans officer for the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. He retired in the late 70s. As you'll see, he hasn't retired. He went from defense to NSC. He's the man behind Alexander Haig, Vernon Walters, our UN ambassador now, James Schlesinger, and R. Froelich. Walters also helped overthrow the government of Brazil with Frank Carlucci, our current national security advisor. He came from a German family, wealthy in the chemical dyes industry and in paraffin in Germany, probably IG Farben, because that was they had the monopoly on the dyes and chemicals before, during, and after the war. He came from a family of a monarchist. His son Sven Kraemer was in Nazi Germany during the war. He picked him up after the war, Mr. Kraemer, and brought them to the United States, where his political career moved on, his military political. He came to the United States originally in 1943, while his wife and son and mother in Nazi Germany were living there. He joined the United States Army Intelligence, and he recruited Henry Kissinger, who was also in United States Intelligence, and Fritz Kraemer and Henry Kissinger were stationed at Oberammergau when the war was over. As I say, Kissinger then went on to Harvard. Kraemer went to the Pentagon. Both were in the Battle of the Bulge at the same time that the Waffen-SS had Hitler's top generals in the Battle of the Bulge, and one of Hitler's top generals was named Fritz Kraemer. Now, the background I've given you, just a few sentences, comes about the one who currently runs the National Security Council. That's his background, how he came to America, just in a few sentences, written by Nick Themisch. Now, Adolf Hitler had a Fritz Kraemer, I learned as I began to study this other Fritz Kraemer. Adolf Hitler had three important men, the most important at the end of World War II, around him. One was a General Fritz Kraemer, one was Sepp Dietrich, and the other was Otto Skorzeny. The liaison between those men and Adolf Hitler and the Vatican was Richard von Weizsäcker, whose son now is the current president of Germany. Hitler had all three, when the Battle of the Bulge was over and America won the war by May of 1945, all three of these men important to Hitler were taken prisoner together, Kraemer, Dietrich, and Skorzeny. All three were in charge of the Battle of the Bulge for Hitler after the war, and all three were stationed in the exact locations of Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kraemer, who were German, who put on American military uniforms and were located in the same location as Hitler's agents. I'll take a 1-minute break and continue with the overlapping of these persons. There is one name and two persons, and I think it's one name and one person, and that's why it's important to pursue this particular problem. This is Mae Brussell, and the second half of broadcast 787, World Watchers, the second half. In case you missed the first part, just bear with us. You can get a tape. They're available if you write to me. I'll tell you how to get them. But this is a very important subject because of an article of in the newspaper, particularly Michael Novak, because he's more prominent than Rowland Evans, on the light of Reagan's life and the conservatives' policies by having Fritz Kraemer continue in the National Security Council. And until this point, I knew he was of tremendous influence, sharing offices with Daniel Graham of Star Wars and Fred Ikle, deputy of the Defense Department. But here he is being retained, which means he's there in the first place, and all of the Reagan policies have been identical to the policies of Adolf Hitler during World War II. I always referred to the grenade invasion as a blitzkrieg, similar to the way Hitler took the smaller countries, and it was run by the same people that did the blitzkrieg for Adolf Hitler. Now, to get back to Hitler's Kraemer, Sepp Dietrich was released they were taken as war prisoners. Sepp Dietrich was released as a war prisoner, along with Otto Skorzeny and Fritz Kraemer, thanks to the work of Senator Joe McCarthy. I'll give you some more details on their release in a few moments. But these men were released. A new senator who was stationed in the South Pacific was put into office by two very pro-Nazi Germans in Wisconsin. And as soon as he was in office, he went to Europe and made sure that the defendants in the Dachau trial, because of the Malmedy massacre, would be released. And among them was Hitler's Fritz Kraemer, I referred to as prisoner 33. Now, Adolf Hitler's Fritz Kraemer is in books about World War II as a Dachau prisoner, and there is no other account. There's just one, and I have put holes or read through it, and I'll share it with you. One account so far of anything he did in the Eastern Division or anywhere to become a general. He was a general, and he was one of the very few war criminals. There were very few considering how many crimes were committed, but he doesn't appear anywhere noticeable in any battles in South Africa, in Africa, or North Africa rather, or in the eastern part of Europe that would earn him the title of general. Hitler's Fritz Kraemer helped the United States Army historians after the war when he was a prisoner, and a Mr. Cole wrote about the assistance of the Germans in helping the Americans write the German side of the war, and Fritz Kraemer helped the United States Army write the history about the area that he was in. Hitler's Fritz Kraemer disappeared from all Nazi history books after he was released from Dachau prison. There's only one picture of him as a prisoner and nothing before, and whereas all the others, a team of 70, a group of, almost 70, I believe, that were arrested, They all have a history before, after, or since. The only one who has no face in any history books is Hitler's Fritz Kraemer. Where did he go? He's not written up, and there's no record of him. Even in Israel, I wrote to them for information about Fritz Kraemer. They didn't have any. Hitler's Fritz Kraemer is seldom mentioned in any single context at all. Kissinger's Kraemer, who worked with Hitler's Kraemer, is also never photographed. You never see his face. And one of the crimes of the Fritz Kraemer at the Battle of the Bulge was that as commanding officer, he ordered all people, all Americans, prisoners, to be shot right at sight, not to be kept alive. Now, we made an agreement at the end of the war, before the end of the war, how we would coordinate our military and intelligence with the German army, and Alan Dulles was in Bern, Switzerland from 1943, making deals directly with the top Nazis. So it seems that they would want our good graces or be kind and keep our prisoners alive. But I believe the reason the orders came from Kraemer to kill all persons who saw them was that nobody would recognize him if a situation such as today appeared. Henry Kissinger's Kraemer planned the Vietnam War. He was over Westmoreland and made strategic decisions that are now part of our history. Henry Kissinger's mentor is never seen with Kraemer. There isn't a single photograph of Henry Kissinger next to Fritz Kraemer, although he writes about him in his autobiography, and he's written in other books about Henry Kissinger. So why is Hitler's Fritz Kraemer so scarce if he was so important to Hitler, and why is Henry Kissinger's Kraemer so scarce if he was so influential in his life? And of course the question is, are they the same person? It's time to get them photographed. And I wrote to Peter Rodino a long time ago, because it was his a committee that was supposed to look into Nazi war criminals who came into this country, and Reinhard Gehlen was not considered a criminal. He wasn't charged, or the charges were dropped. But this guy has a number and a case record against him, so if it's the same one, it would be interesting to know. Now, one of their partners, Otto Skorzeny, who set up the terrorist teams after the war and worked with all the top Nazis, and particularly in the Middle East, in Libya and Egypt and in North Africa and in the PLO and all the Palestinian groups and Muslims, Otto Skorzeny was a key man to all of this, and he worked with our CIA after the war. I wrote about him in my article in Rebel on the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination. Now, some of the books I have in references, I'll next week send them out with the tapes. As I say, some of you have this sheet and some of you don't. Washington Post, March the 3rd, 1975, the Nick Themisch article, The Iron Mentor. There's another book, Henry Kissinger, Ralph Blumenthal's book, Signet book in 1974, The Importance of Henry Kissinger and the Fritz Kraemer Relationship. Hitler's Bodyguards, a Ballantine book, book number 39, published in 1974. There's a picture of Nazi war criminal Fritz Kraemer. Otto Skorzeny, the book on Otto Skorzeny by Charles Whiting, War Leader book number 11, has a picture of Fritz Kraemer at the Dachau trial. David Hanna, December 1944, wrote Kissinger and His Rise, and he suggests a strong relationship between Kissinger and Kraemer. It was later than 44. I mistyped this date. Hitler's Last Gamble by Jacques Nobelcart, Schocken Books, 1967, goes into the importance of Fritz Kraemer. The Damned Engineers by Janice Giles, 1970. The Adventures of a Bystander by Peter Drucker, the man who invented Henry Kissinger, writes about Fritz Kraemer, page 141 to 157. In The Last Days of Patton, Ladislao Farrago, McGraw-Hill published that in 1981. They say that Fritz Kraemer was with Patton and that he was a U.S. Army general. Now, Hitler's Fritz Kraemer was a general, ours was a lieutenant, and if they're the same, they've got the military mixed up, because he was a general, as I say, for Hitler, and Patton might have believed, or the persons writing about him might have believed, that the other one was a general too, although Charles Whiting has done a lot on the Battle of the Bulge in this time period and should know better. Or rather, the story of Patton was written by Farrago. Again, I'm sorry, it wasn't Whiting, who all the more reason would know the difference between a lieutenant and a general. Now, there are some very important dates in the lives of these men that I talk about all of the time, and they somewhat overlap. They're important because of the relationship that develops into Ronald Reagan and how he ends up with 6 years with Fritz Kraemer and Sven Kraemer at the National Security Council. And these dates are particular dates about Kissinger and Kraemer, and then I'm going into the Reagan dates. In 1930, Dr. Hermann Friedrich Urban, a member of Hitler's Gestapo, was naturalized in San Francisco. In 1933, 3 years later, he recruited Errol Flynn into the Gestapo while he was at Warner Brothers in Hollywood. In 1937, 4 years later, Peter Drucker from Vienna and Frankfurt, Germany, came to the United States, and in 1937, Ronald Reagan was brought to Hollywood from Christian College in Illinois by Music Corporation of America. 1938, 1 year later, Henry Kissinger came to the United States from Germany also, as did Urban, Drucker, and then Kissinger, and he soon went into U.S. military intelligence. In 1939, Gustav Anton Kraemer, Fritz Gustav Anton Kraemer, came from Germany and Italy, brought here by Peter Drucker, the man behind these multinational corporations. He came to the United States and went into Army intelligence in 1939. In 1940, Errol Flynn in the Gestapo was co-starring with Ronald Reagan at Warner Brothers, and Reagan, during the war, was soon to be making movies about Punamud, where the space rocket scientists were working, who were later brought to the United States. In 1943, Fritz Kraemer and Henry Kissinger, this is 3 years after Flynn and Reagan were co-starring together, they did a movie in 1940 and one in 1942. Desperate Journey was the other movie they did together. They filmed two together, Flynn and Reagan, 1940 and 1942. The next year, Fritz Kraemer and Henry Kissinger, both from Germany, both in Army intelligence, make their connection in Louisiana, and 1 year later, 1944, Fritz Kraemer and Henry Kissinger are in Germany, located in December at the Battle of the Bulge, the battle where Otto Skorzeny and Hitler's Fritz Kraemer and Sepp Dietrich and the other powerful Germans would meet them in some form or other in that identical location. Now, Otto Skorzeny not only was great on terrorism, but he was assigned by Hitler for 2 years to set up a team that would emulate Americans. And according to the laws of war, believe it or not, there are some, you're not supposed to wear the uniform of the other side. And Otto Skorzeny trained his people to smoke like Americans, hold a cigarette a certain way, talk like Americans, use English words, and he got a hold of United States trucks and tanks and uniforms so that he could infiltrate where the Americans were and kill them, because the Americans thought they were working with friends. And when some of them died on the battlefield and they took off the American uniform, they found the Gestapo or the German uniform underneath, not necessarily members of the Gestapo, but the younger army and so forth. And they had been deceived by Skorzeny, so he had access to American material, and these people meet at the Battle of the Bulge in some way. In 1945, Fritz Kraemer and Henry Kissinger, and also the other Fritz Kraemer from Germany, allegedly at Oberammergau. One is Hitler's top general as a prisoner. The other is Henry Kissinger staying at a castle with special treatment put there by John J. McCloy, and the president of Chase Manhattan Bank, later representing the Rockefeller interests, an attorney for I.G. Farben, and so forth, and allegedly the Kraemer from Germany, Frankfurt, and so forth, in Italy, is over there also. So it's very coincidental that there were two Fritz Kraemers and one Kissinger in the same location. One, a German who wears American uniform, who recruits Kissinger, and the other, a German who Hitler used towards the end of the war. Now, in 1945, Klaus Barbie and other top Nazi war criminals were in with them, and General Patton worked with these people. And in 1948, Fritz Kraemer, the one that put Henry Kissinger into Harvard after being in Germany, joins the Pentagon and takes over as plans officer in 1948. 32 years of military coups we've seen in this country. I won't run them down again. But 2 years later, John McCloy releases all the top war criminals to start their banking and organizing over again. Hallmark and Hermann Abs and people from IG Farben and the head of the Deutsche Bank and very prominent people. Hermann Abs went on to the Vatican to help the Pope at the time of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal that involved Licio Gelli and Francisco Pazienza walking around. Hermann Abs of the Deutsche Bank and other top war criminals were released from prison by John McCloy, who was working for Chase Manhattan and for IG Farben, and a lawyer for the Chase Manhattan Bank and for the Rockefellers. In 1964, McCloy, who put Henry Kissinger in Harvard, was assigned by Allen Dulles to be a member of the Warren Commission, and they were to cover up the murder of John Kennedy, and McCloy was in charge of the Soviet Union branch of the contacts of Lee Harvey Oswald. And in 1984, Henry Kissinger is on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board to Ronald Reagan. Kissinger sits on that, and since 1980, we find out through 86, and seems to be there tighter than ever, we have a Fritz Kraemer sitting in the national security, and he's been there all of these years while Reagan was in office. I'm sure he was sitting there when Zbigniew Brzezinski was running NSC for Jimmy Carter, but these scandals didn't come out, and therefore their names didn't come out. Now, the chronology of these people is very important. There are other dates I want to give to you. I don't expect you to remember them all, but to get the idea of this matter. Dr. Hermann Frederick Urban, who recruited co-partner Errol Flynn, Ronald Reagan's acting friend, into the Gestapo, came to the United States in 1930. He joined the Gestapo in Germany in 1922 when it was first formed. Then he went to San Francisco and he joined the team in Hollywood, particularly, recruited them and worked with them and started traveling. But in the United States, he made himself an American citizen. Then went back to Germany, and he has still two strong Nazi sons who I understand work in Spain. And Charles Hyam has done a lot of work on Dr. Urban. He's the one who surfaced and brought this man out when he was studying the Nazi connections of Errol Flynn. In 1933, Walter Duisberg, the son of Carl Duisberg, who founded IG Farben, became a United States citizen and set up headquarters in New Jersey. Errol Flynn was working for Dr. Urban at the time, and as I say, Peter Drucker came over here, and the same year that Drucker came from Frankfurt and Vienna, Ronald Reagan was brought by Music Corporation of America and was recruited from a fundamentalist Christian college in Eureka of 300 students. When Henry Kissinger came from Germany in 1938, it was the same year that Joseph Mengele, the doctor from Auschwitz, came to the United States, to New York, and picked up a United States citizenship, just as Dr. Urban had done in 1930, 8 years earlier, before he recruited, the most famous of course, is Errol Flynn. And in 1939, the year after Kissinger came to this country, and the year after Mengele was naturalized in New York, Fritz Kraemer came to the country in 1939, and he came from Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. He was brought to the United States by Peter Drucker, who's down at Claremont, California, who writes a lot of books on the huge multinational corporations, and he was put right into U.S. intelligence. At the same time he was put into intelligence, Karl Wiedenbach, from Germany and from Franco, Spain, became a U.S. intelligence agent for General Douglas MacArthur. He attended the Kriegsakademie in Germany, which was Adolf Hitler's war school, and was put out in the Pacific, in the Philippines, with Douglas MacArthur, and he was instrumental in releasing the Japanese war criminals, among them the likes of Ryoshi Sasakawa and the top Japanese that were doing torturing and experiments on Americans and Chinese and other people. He changed his name to Charles Willoughby to make it more English. It was Karl Wiedenbach. As I said before, in 1940, Santa Fe Trail was being made at Warner Brothers with Flynn and Reagan. desperate journey was being made by Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan in that time period. In 1943, 1 year after they were co-starring in a movie, Fritz Kraemer goes into his U.S. intelligence uniform. He's been in this country 4 years. He goes into U.S. intelligence, and Henry Kissinger is also now in U.S. intelligence, both from Germany, Kissinger recruited by Kraemer. In 1944, 1 year after Kraemer and Kissinger meet, is when Otto Skorzeny started training 400 Nazi werewolf recruits for the Fourth Reich. In 1943, by May 43, the powers that be in Germany and in the United States knew that Hitler couldn't win the war against Russia. Skorzeny was instrumental in setting up 400 future Nazi werewolves that they would use after the war. And in 1944, Kraemer and Kissinger and Skorzeny, as I say, were in that same battle scene in the Bulge, stalling the war until Martin Bormann's treasures and money could be taken out of there. Now, in 1948, when Kraemer becomes plans officer of the Pentagon, we soon have the confrontation between North and South Korea. And in 1950, with the excuse of North Korea being invaded by communists from above, this country announced that they would bring in Germans, including Otto von Bolschwing, whose name appears, the organization he set up, later in 1986 with the General Sea Corps Helene von Damm and Mr. Albert Hakim connections. Otto Skorzeny in 1949 went to Argentina, where he was with Eva and Juan Perón and the top Nazis and had access to the Bormann funds to rebuild the Nazi Empire. 1950, as the Cold War went on and brought in Otto von Bolschwing and his likes, John J. McCloy released the top Nazi war criminals. In 1954, Reverend Sung Min Yoon connects with Ryosha Sasakawa and begins the World Organization for Media Persons, for Scientists, for papers like the Washington Times, and Moon becomes a large instrumental figure with the World Anti-Communist League and with the right-wing network throughout the world. In 1953, Otto Albrecht von Bolschwing from the SS Gestapo moves to California, and in 1959, 6 years later, his corporation TCI, that becomes Stanford Technology, has his secretary and translator, Helene von Damm, as the secretary to Ronald Reagan when he becomes governor in 1966 to 1974. Von Damm makes the appointments for him, and then when he goes to Washington in 1980, and again in 1984, before she becomes ambassador to Vienna, Helene von Damm from the TCI Corporation, that became Stanford Technology, has made the appointments for the Reagan administration. Now, in a book called Nazi War Criminals in America, the Basic Handbook, it's written by Charles Allen, the well-known Nazi hunter. And the book is important for lots of reasons, and I want to just share one with you. Because of the close relationship of Klaus Barbie to Fritz Kraemer and Henry Kissinger and the likes, and Joseph Mengele was recognized and identified as being in cocaine traffic with Barbie in 1979 through a lot of papers in the CIA that were given to Senator D'Amato and Arlen Specter. Senator Specter was on the Warren Commission. The importance of Mengele and Barbie and Fritz Kraemer, and with Fritz Kraemer sitting in the NSC these past 6 years, and certainly to reshape it for the next 2 years or forever in this palace coup. I just want to share one page of Allen's book on Nazi war criminals. He talks about the Mengele case and the U.S. involvement, and he tells how after the war he spent time, Joseph Mengele, as an intern patient in a British hospital in occupied Germany. He lived with his family in Günzburg, Germany. That the family is wealthy. It's a multinational farm equipment company. And when people accused Mengele of doing the tortures at Auschwitz from about 1949 on, he went out of sight, and he got a false name, a passport under Gregorio Gregori. He went to Franco, Spain. That was where Skorzeny's headquarters, and Hans Ulrich Rudel, then to Argentina. And Mr. Allen goes on to say that he practiced medicine in Buenos Aires. And with the stories about Mengele's 2 years ago or a year ago, a lot more details were given about Joseph Mengele. This book came out in 1985, just before Mengele was allegedly discovered in a coffin in San Paulo, another crock of lies. But in talking about Mengele, he says that there are a lot of people, investigators, self-appointed, he uses a derisive, puts down people who are looking for Nazi war criminals outside of himself, that are looking, he says, for exploitation or sensationalism, that there's a lot of this going on. But he cites a 1966 report on U.S. Nazis, and he said a copy of a confidential FBI report on Mengele, dated December the 8th, 1966, carries the allegations, and this is FBI, that Joseph Mengele was in Arizona using the name Harold Endenen, and this has been circulated among self-described Nazi hunters in the U.S. The author of Basic Handbook, that's Charles Allen himself, was once asked to join a West Coast radio program to expose this latest development. The invitation was declined. Now, Mae Brussell was the lady who invited him to join a West Coast radio program to expose the connection of these people. And why did he decline it? He didn't decline it because the evidence wasn't true. He just declined it. He said he was asked to join a program, and he declined it. And he goes on in this chapter of his book, page 71, to say the FBI report carries a note that the files of the LA office reflect that a Joseph Mengele was the subject of a special agent report dated February the 9th, 1944 in New York, that he was a subject of denaturalization proceedings, apparently because his name was on a Nazi party list, and they ruled out the fact that he had been naturalized in the United States. There was a membership number of the Nazi Party, and he entered the United States August 1st, 1932, born in Munich, Germany, and it has his address in the Bronx of New York at one time. And they threw out the fact that this particular person had been a naturalized American citizen like Dr. Urban, who was in fact an American citizen. Now, the reason this report came out, and I sent it to him and members of Congress, was because a listener to World Watchers in Sacramento, my program used to be on every week for about 4 years, was down in Honduras with his uncle and sat in the presence of Joseph Mengele in Honduras. And he asked his uncle, how come this guy's still floating around? The uncle had fled Oakland. He was suspected of being a Nazi war criminal at the shipyards during World War II. And he said, because Mengele is an American citizen. So using the new Freedom of Information Act, this fellow sent for it and found the information on the naturalized papers. And then the experts come in, like Charles Allen, and say, I declined to talk about this publicly. Now, I want to talk about the General Accounting Office, and I want to talk about a problem that I've had all these years trying to find Fritz Kraemer. And he's written up in books, as I say, there's a Kraemer with a war record, there's a Kraemer running our government, there's a Kraemer with Fred Ikle, there's a Kraemer, the mentor of Alexander Haig and Kissinger, are probably the two most powerful men up front in our country. And I can get no satisfaction from other persons, and I'm not going to give you a reason. You have to draw your own conclusions about it. One, I have a copy of a letter I wrote to Beat Klarsfeld about this problem. I sent it to her New York office. I sent it to her in France. I never got an answer. Beat Klarsfeld is the woman who takes the credit, rightfully so, I suppose, of having Klaus Barbie taken from Bolivia to France, where he's to stand trial. But that was January 1983. It is 3 years now, and I don't even see him going to a trial. He may or he may not, but he's been sitting in France for 3 years. Now, a listener to World Watchers in San Francisco, Pat Carey, went to where Beat Klarsfeld was speaking several weeks ago, and some of you listeners heard her in San Jose. And this friend asked her about Fritz Kraemer and Mae Brussell's need to have help in confirming or denying that our Pentagon has been run by Hitler's top general. And Beat Klarsfeld answered this way. She said, he isn't of influence anymore, which meant to Pat, a long friend, that she knew where he was, but it didn't matter where he was. And I read every word of that small Evans and Novak column to show you that it matters, that they account to no one. They account not to the Congress. They're more powerful than the State Department. He has the power to go right to the president. No more basement doors. It matters, and it matters because the people around him are in charge of the Central American policy as well as a lot of other policies. Now, John Stockwell was here about a month ago. He's written a book on the CIA. He was station chief in Angola. He lectured at the Monterey Institute, Era of International Studies. John McCone is one of the directors and probably the dean of this whole group at the Monterey Institute. He was CIA director when John Kennedy was killed, they resurrected Allen Dulles to be on the Warren Commission under his direction, and he was CIA director when Nixon ordered the destabilization of Chile and the murder of Salvador Allende, which involves the very people that are in the CONTRA-GATE, Reagan-Gate right now. Tickets for his lecture at Monterey Institute were free to students. They subsidized the lecture for students to hear Stockwell talk about the CIA. Now, I asked Stockwell, Pat Carey came down from San Francisco and started to ask him about helping find Fritz Kraemer, that Mae Brussell is working on this matter. And then I asked him about it. They took questions from the audience. And I said, would you help me locate him? Because I think it matters, given the tone of our policies and what is happening in Central America. He was talking about Nicaragua. It would matter if Hitler's top general were running it or not. And he said to me, it wouldn't make any difference because Kraemer is not important anymore. He's not on the scene, so it's not pertinent to what he was lecturing about. And Stockwell goes all over the country talking about the terrible things in Nicaragua and the terrible CIA. And my objection to these people is that CIA is the new Jew or the new black. It's the new minority, or always has been, that you can talk about them and not the National Security Agency, not the National Security Council. You can't talk about Navy intelligence. You can't talk about the Defense Intelligence Agency. The Puzzle Palace is the closest to the National Security Agency there is. But the NSC and the DIA and the Navy are untouchable no matter what administrations come and go. And Stockwell's answer was that it's not important to Central America, or Nicaragua particularly, who Fritz Kraemer is. And I responded that Henry Kissinger was given that territory by Ronald Reagan, so therefore if this is his mentor who's behind him, it matters, of course, what kind of policy we have. And Stockwell passed that off as not being important, as did B. Clarksville, as did Charles Allen. And I wrote to Elie Wiesel, who just got the Nobel Prize, and asked him to help me find Fritz Kraemer. He told me write to Israel, where they keep a record of war criminals. There was no Fritz Kraemer listed there. And Simon Wiesenthal wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Fritz Kraemer isn't important to him. I sent him letters and details, and Rabbi Cooper and Rabbi Heyer at the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles when the president was going to Bitburg, and they told me it didn't matter. Now, my time, you can be sure I'll be following this up for weeks or years to come now that the name has surfaced, and the important position he has proves all along that I was correct about those Prussians in the White House. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with more on Reagan-Gate, Carter-Gate, and Fritz Kraemer from the National Security Council. Next week we will continue along these lines.